A few months ago, I spoke with a researcher who had just returned from the Yamal Peninsula in the Russian Arctic. He described the silence of the tundra as almost eerie. But what stayed with him wasn't the cold, it was the smell.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that landscape is completely unforgiving.
It really is.
Yeah.
He told me about a specific stretch of land where the ground seemed to be sighing, turning from iron-hard permafrost into a soft, grayish sludge that smelled of swamp gas and ancient decay. He looked at this landscape not with the excitement of a scientist discovering a new frontier, but with a palpable, quiet dread.
I can completely understand why he'd feel that way.
Right. He pointed out a spot where a reindeer carcass had recently emerged from the mud, perfectly preserved after 70 years. At first, it looked like a miracle of nature, a biological time capsule frozen in time. The local herders initially thought nothing of it.
Because, why would they? It just looks like a frozen animal.
Exactly. But then the miracle turned into a nightmare. Dozens of people were suddenly hospitalized, thousands of reindeer dropped dead across the plains. It wasn't a new plague they were fighting, it was ghost.
The anthrax.
Yes. Anthrax, dormant for nearly a century, had simply woken up because the sun hit it for the first time since the 1940s. The researcher told me something that chilled me more than the Siberian wind. He said, "We're worried about the hazards we recognize, like anthrax. But we should be terrified of the ones we've forgotten even exist."
That was just a deeply terrifying thought.
He described a laboratory where scientists recently took a sample of frozen Earth from 48,500 years ago, a time when Neanderthals were still the dominant human species. They didn't find a fossil or a skeleton. They found a virus. And once they thought it out, it didn't just sit there, it started hunting again.
It woke right back up, just like that.
It creates this unsettling contradiction. We spend billions of dollars searching for microscopic life on Mars, yet we are currently presiding over the accidental resurrection of organisms on our own planet that our immune systems haven't encountered in 50 millennia. It makes you wonder, as the frost retreats, are we unlocking a scientific goldmine, or are we simply opening a door that was meant to stay locked forever?
Yeah, and the magnitude of that unlocked door becomes truly terrifying when you actually examine the lived reality of the people standing directly on the threshold.
People who are just dealing with this every single day.
Exactly. We are talking about public health preparedness strategies for potential ancient outbreaks. And right now, these strategies are basically being tested on individuals who are entirely unequipped for the scale of the threat.
So today on the Deep Dive, we are looking at all of this, the pathogens, the environmental feedback loops, the collapsing infrastructure, and we're going to start with the people on the front lines.
Right, because you really have to consider the daily experience of someone like Anton. He's a veterinarian working out there on the Yamal Peninsula.
Just a local guy trying to do his job.
Yeah, just a local vet. And on any given day, he's sitting in the cab of this aging UAZ utility truck. You know those old blocky Soviet-era trucks?
Oh yeah, the ones that look like they're made of solid cast iron.
Exactly. And the suspension on this thing is just groaning as it navigates these deep, thawing ruts of the tundra. The engine is just rattling against this immense, oppressive silence. And Anton's hands gripping the steering wheel, they still bear these faint, ghost-like tremors from that 2016 Anthrax outbreak you mentioned.
The one the locals call the Siberian plague.
Right, the Siberian plague. The terror that literally clawed its way out of a reindeer carcass that had been dead for 70 years. For Anton, that memory is not, just a statistic in some medical journal. It is a profound physical and psychological trauma.
And that physical reaction really speaks to the sheer sensory horror of the event. When you dive into the sources and listen to accounts from that summer, the defining characteristic wasn't just panic.
No, it was chaos.
Total logistical nightmare. They were fighting an invisible enemy these kids are supposed to be the frontline defense for public health preparedness. Yet they are filled with mostly expired masks, brittle plastic sheeting, and just rudimentary disinfectants.
That is so bleak.
When he looks at those boxes, he experiences this suffocating sense of vulnerability. He recognizes a fundamental shift in the geology beneath him.
Because Anton knows the official public health protocols, sure, but he also knows the soil. He's out there every day.
He feels the ground changing.
Exactly. His chilling realization is that the permafrost is no longer a solid floor. It has transformed into the softening lid on a highly pressurized biological vessel.
A pressure cooker just waiting to blow.
Yeah. And when he watches groups of Nanette's herders moving across the distant horizon, just mere silhouettes against this vast gray sky, he is overcome with a profound helplessness.
Because he knows he can't protect them.
Right. He's painfully aware that he, armed with basically nothing but a clipboard, an aging truck, and a radio that frequently struggles to find a signal in the thawing mud, is the very first line of defense against microscopic enemies that have been waiting patiently since the Bronze Age.
Which is just an impossible burden for one person. But, the mechanics of how that 2016 outbreak actually happened are vital to understand. Because it wasn't a spontaneous stroke of bad luck.
Yeah.
The anthrax didn't just magically appear out of nowhere. It was the culmination of highly specific environmental anomalies. The sources point out that the region experienced a 6-year period of rapid permafrost thawing leading up to that exact moment.
It was a very precise climatological sequence. It wasn't just one hot summer.
Walk us through that sequence, because it's actually really counterintuitive.
So the sequence began with a few relatively warm years, which initiated the destabilization of the active layer of the permafrost.
And just to clarify, the active layer is the top layer of soil that naturally thaws in the summer and freezes in the winter.
Exactly. So that top layer starts getting a bit unstable. But the critical anomaly, the really weird part, was what followed. Those warm years were subsequently followed by abnormally cold years that featured an unusually thick snow cover across the peninsula.
Because you are losing me. Thick snow usually means we are in the middle of a deep, brutal freeze. How does a massive blizzard or a heavy layer of snow actually cause the ground beneath it to thaw out?
I know, it sounds totally backward, but snow actually operates as a highly efficient thermal blanket.
A blanket made of ice.
Yeah. It comes down to the physical properties of the snowpack itself. Snow is not solid ice. It is composed of these complex crystals that trap vast amounts of ambient air between them.
Oh, right, like a down jacket.
Exactly like a down jacket. Because air is a very poor conductor of heat, a thick layer of snow creates a powerful insulation barrier. When the snow depth exceeds 50 centimeters, it effectively shields the ground from the extreme sub-zero cold of the Arctic winter air.
So the bitter cold simply cannot penetrate the snowpack.
Right. The cold stays above the snow. As a result, the ground retains the ambient heat it accumulated during the brief summer months.
Wow.
The underlying permafrost temperatures can actually rise up to 6 degrees Celsius higher than the local mean annual air temperature. The soil is artificially incubated throughout the darkest, coldest months of the year.
So the ground is literally denied its hard winter reset. It stays soft, warm, and biologically active under a blanket of snow.
Yep, it just simmers down there.
And then you factor in the summer of 2016, which brought a historic drought. We're talking about rainfall in July of that year, dropping to less than 10% of its 30-year historical average.
Less than 10%? It was a desert out there.
The soil didn't just thaw, it completely dried out. It turned into this fine, powdery dust. And that bone-dry environment is the mechanical vector. The anthrax spores, which had been pushed to the surface, were caught by the wind, aerosolized in the dust, and spread across vast tracts of dry vegetation.
Which the reindeer is subsequently consumed.
And they just grazed right over it.
And, the biology of the anthrax bacterium itself, Bacillus anthracis, makes it uniquely suited for this exact scenario. It's almost built for this. Well, when the bacterium detects that its environment is becoming hostile-like, when it lacks nutrients or moisture, say during a massive drought, it undergoes this radical transformation. It literally strips away its own water content, condenses its DNA, and wraps itself in a dense, highly durable protein armor.
It builds a bunker for itself.
Exactly. It becomes an endospore. In this state, it effectively pauses its own biological clock. Its metabolism drops to absolute zero.
So it's not even really alive in a traditional sense, just suspended.
Right. These spores are virtually impervious to extreme cold, UV radiation, and drought. They can remain viable for centuries, just suspended in the frozen darkness of the permafrost, waiting for the exact right conditions, like that dry, dusty summer of 2016, to awaken, enter a host, and resume their deadly life cycle.
And epidemiological modelers have had to completely rethink their approach to map out this threat. Right, because it's not a normal disease model.
No, the old models do not work here. They now separate these spores into two distinct reservoirs. First, you have the fresh spores.
The ones actively being released into the environment from the bodily fluids and carcasses of newly dead hosts, like the reindeer in 2016.
Exactly. Those are the immediate visible threat. But second, there are the older spores, the ones that have been locked deep down in the active layer of the permafrost for decades or even centuries.
The sleeping giants.
Right. And the terrifying part is how those old spores travel upward. Because they don't just stay put. The geological process is called cryoturbation.
Cryoturbation. I love the analogy the sources use for this.
The ice cream analogy.
Imagine a tub of ice cream that you repeatedly let melt on the kitchen counter and then shove back into the freezer over and over again. Right. And it doesn't freeze uniformly after that. It gets icy, it churns, and the dense ingredients like the chocolate chunks or the caramel at the bottom, they get physically pushed toward the top.
That is exactly what cryoturbation is.
So as the active layer of the permafrost freezes from the top down during the onset of winter, it traps pockets of unfrozen, waterlogged soil beneath it.
And because water expands when it freezes, the immense pressure from that expanding ice forces this unfrozen mud to churn and heave upward. It literally physically moves buried organic matter and all the dormant spores within it closer to the surface.
It's pushing the ancient stuff right up to the modern ground level.
Yep. Coupled with solifluction, which is the slow downward flow of this saturated soil across the landscape, the Earth itself is basically acting as this slow-motion biological blender. It is constantly pushing ancient pathogens up into the grazing paths of modern animals.
That is an incredibly vivid and terrifying image. A slow-motion biological blender. And to truly grasp the mathematical certainty of these outbreaks, we have to look at something called flocate theory.
Yeah, flocate theory. This is where the math gets really interesting.
So, for you listening, flocate theory is a branch of mathematics used to analyze systems that are subjected to periodic repeating forces, like, say, pushing a swing at the exact right moment over and over. Or, in this case, the intense seasonal shifts of the Arctic.
Right. When mathematical modelers apply flocate theory to this specific pathogen landscape, the results are deeply concerning.
Because normally, you wouldn't expect anthrax to thrive in Siberia.
Exactly. Even if the average annual temperature in Siberia wouldn't normally be high enough to support a sustained endemic anthrax outbreak, the violent seasonal fluctuations actually manipulate the math. Well, the extreme swings, the deep, insulating snows in the winter, followed by the rapid, drought-stricken thaws in the summer, they artificially push the disease's basic reproduction number, or R0, past the critical tipping point.
So the environment itself is overriding the natural limits of the pathogen.
Yes. These brief, intense windows of perfect transmission conditions ensure that the disease does not simply die out naturally in the cold. Instead, it becomes a sustained, endemic presence in the ecosystem.
It essentially finds a loophole in the climate.
A mathematical loophole. And the math dictates that as the seasonal swings become more extreme due to climate change, the outbreaks will just become more frequent and more severe.
Which is grim. But, if a 70-year-old anthrax spore surviving and utilizing extreme weather to trigger an outbreak is a nightmare, we really have to ask what happens when we look further down into the ice.
Oh, much further down.
Right? Are there things buried down there older than the 1940s? And this brings us to the deeper, vastly older threats locked in the permafrost. The dual climate feedback loop, where permafrost melt, releases both greenhouse gases and dormant pathogens that could fundamentally disrupt ecosystems and human health.
Yeah, we have to transition our focus from pathogens measured in decades to pathogens measured in tens of thousands of years.
Which is almost hard to wrap your head around.
Consider the work of Dr. Irina, a researcher operating out in the deep Siberian permafrost. Her daily laboratory is the edge of a towering Yadoma cliff near the Kolyma River.
And Yadoma is a very specific type of permafrost, right?
Yeah, Yadoma is a type of Pleistocene-age permafrost. It is incredibly rich in organic material. It's basically the preserved remains of ancient steppe tundra ecosystems.
It's just frozen solid for millennia.
Right. And standing on the precipice of this cliff, she observes the physical dissolution of the ground in real time. The permafrost is literally melting and collapsing into the river water beneath it.
The sources describe the structural failure of the soil, creating a sound like a slow, wet heartbeat.
Which is just so eerie.
And with every massive chunk of earth that calves off the cliff face and falls into the river, the ground releases a foul-smelling breath of methane gas that has been trapped since the last ice age.
Just venting straight into our modern atmosphere. And, inside her laboratory, the dual threat of climate change and ancient biology becomes intensely personal.
Tell us about the sample she found.
So Dr. Irina spent months meticulously working with a sample of silt extracted from that very cliff face. And this silt was carbon dated to 30,000 years ago.
30,000 years. That's before recorded history.
She was attempting to isolate a strain of pithervirus. And when that ancient organic matter finally thawed in her petri dish under the sterile lights of her lab, it didn't just sit there inert.
It didn't just turn to mud.
No. The cellular structures rehydrated. The biological mechanisms fired back up. The organism woke up and immediately began seeking a host.
Wild. She describes the sensation of looking through her microscope at this revived organism as a profound temporal vertigo.
Temporal vertigo. Yeah.
She was observing a giant, complex virus that was utterly indifferent to the Holocene, our current geological epoch. It possessed a genetic architecture that had not actively interacted with the Earth's biosphere since long before the first human city was ever built.
And you really have to think about the psychological toll of this specific type of research. It's severe and it's incredibly isolating. She recounts evenings after a long shift where she would just find herself standing at the sink, scrubbing her hands with harsh disinfectants until they bled.
Just out of sheer paranoia.
Yeah, because she was gripped by this terrifying, inescapable realization that the very air she was monitoring for ancient greenhouse gases might also carry the resurrected breath of an entire biological world that the Earth left behind millennia ago.
And honestly, the catalog of these sleeping giants, currently being uncovered in the ice, reads like an apocalyptic history book.
The
virus Dr. Arena was observing, Pandoravirus yedoma, is a colossal virus estimated to be 48,500 years old.
Which is just an unfathomable amount of time.
Right. Now, Pandoravirus primarily preys on amoebas. It doesn't possess the cellular keys to infect human biology, but its survival serves as the ultimate terrifying proof of concept.
Exactly. Infectivity, the raw ability of a virus to invade a host and replicate, can survive nearly 50,000 years in a deep freeze. If an aminovirus can survive that long, what else is down there waiting for a thaw?
And the catalog is expanding rapidly, right?
Yeah. And it includes pathogens that are deeply uncomfortably familiar to human history. Globally, as the ice and permafrost degrade, researchers have found intact fragments of the 1918 Spanish flu virus.
Ow.
Yeah, preserved in the frozen remains of victims buried in mass graves in the Alaskan tundra. In the Altai Mountains, they have discovered ancient, highly lethal variants of Yersinia pestis.
The bacterium responsible for the bubonic plague.
Exactly. And, most alarmingly, traces of the variola virus, the pathogen that causes smallpox, have been detected in the thawing pulses.
Wait, what are pulses?
Pulses are basically these raised permafrost peat mounds. They found these traces in the Stortalen Mire in northern Sweden.
So it's not just Siberia. This is a global permafrost issue.
Completely global.
And, there's a really good analogy in the sources about the immune system that I want to bring up. If you think of our modern human immune system as a sophisticated, highly updated operating system, it relies entirely on a massive memory bank of virus definition.
Right, like antivirus software.
Exactly. It has a biological mugshot for every germ, cold, and flu our ancestors have fought over the last few thousand years. When a known virus enters the body, the white blood cells recognize the mugshot and attack.
They know exactly what to do.
Right. But these ancient pathogens, like a 50,000-year-old virus, are basically written in biological punch cards. Our modern immune system doesn't even recognize them as malicious code.
It's just total gibberish to our cells.
A Neanderthal-era pathogen enters the bloodstream, and our white blood cells might just float right past it because it doesn't match a single evolutionary mugshot in our database. We have absolutely no patches for this kind of software.
None at all.
So how does the human body even begin to react to something it has no evolutionary blueprint for?
Well, the short answer is it's going to be chaotic. The human immune system entirely lacks immunological memory for these resurrected permafrost pathogens. Immunologists refer to the necessary biological response as an allostatic adaptation of immunity.
Allostatic adaptation.
So allostasis is basically the process of achieving stability through radical change. Because our immune systems cannot rely on their normal playbook of pre-existing antibodies, they will have to completely rewrite the rules of how they operate. They have to fundamentally alter their baseline physiological responses from the ground up, all while under active attack.
That sounds incredibly stressful on the body.
It's a massive systemic shock. Furthermore, this chaotic biological war will almost certainly first present itself in the oral mucosa and the upper respiratory tract.
Because that's how we breathe it in.
Exactly. These soft, vulnerable tissues are the primary entry points where aerosolized ancient pathogens carried on the dust of the thawing tundra, just like the anthrax, will first make contact with human biology.
But the biological set of these ancient viruses is inextricably linked to the atmospheric threat of the thaw. There are two sides of the exact same coin, creating this devastating dual climate feedback loop.
Yeah, you can't separate the biology from the climate science here.
Because the permafrost isn't merely a passive freezer for ancient biological history, it is one of the largest active carbon vaults on the planet. Deep within the ice lies approximately 1,700 billion tons of carbon. And just to put that staggering number into perspective, that is roughly twice the total amount of carbon currently floating in the Earth's atmosphere right now.
Twice as much as what's already causing global warming.
Yes, it is 4 times more carbon than humanity has emitted in total since the very dawn of the Industrial Revolution.
It's hard to even picture that volume of carbon, and the microbial mechanics of the permafrost thaw are exactly what drive this catastrophic feedback loop.
Right, tell us about the microbes.
Well, the permafrost is packed with the frozen, preserved remains of plants, mammoths, ancient vegetation, you name it. As the ground temperature rises, billions of dormant microbes awaken from their frozen state.
Just like the pathogens?
Just like the pathogens, but these microbes are hungry, and they wake up to find themselves surrounded by an endless buffet of previously frozen organic matter.
It's an all-you-can-eat scenario.
Exactly. And as they metabolize and decompose this ancient material, they release massive, unprecedented amounts of carbon dioxide and methane gas as biological byproducts.
And the release of methane is really the true accelerator in this scenario. While carbon dioxide is the most abundant greenhouse gas, methane is vastly more potent in the short term.
Much more potent.
The molecular structure of methane allows it to absorb specific wavelengths of infrared radiation, which is the heat from the sun reflecting off the Earth's surface that carbon dioxide actually allows to pass through.
Right, it catches the heat that CO2 misses.
Over a 20-year period, methane traps roughly 80 times more heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide does.
80 times. That's a staggering multiplier.
And this creates a perfect catastrophic circle. The warming atmosphere melts the ice. The melting ice wakes up the microbes. The microbes digest the ancient carbon and release methane. The highly potent methane accelerates the atmospheric warming, which in turn melts even more ice, waking up more microbes.
But, the relentless release of these gases and ancient pathogens is not happening in some isolated, unpopulated vacuum.
No, there are people and industries right in the middle of it.
It is colliding head-on with aggressive, heavy human industry, leading to this profound conflict between Arctic industrial expansion and the desperate need to preserve the permafrost as a critical barrier against releasing these unknown ancient microbes.
Right.
If you shift your focus to the physical landscape of the New North, you can see the brutal reality of this conflict through the eyes of Sergei. He's a heavy machinery operator working for a massive state-backed gas conglomerate in the Russian Arctic.
So we go from Anton the vet to Sergei the bulldozer driver.
Exactly. And Sergei's daily reality consists of commanding these massive steel drills and driving multi-ton bulldozers into the earth. His job is to extract fossil fuels to feed an insatiable global energy demand.
And to the corporate site manager sitting in warm offices in Moscow, the softening, unpredictable ground is merely a logistical engineering hurdle.
Right, it's just a problem to be overcome with more concrete and steel.
But to Sergei, who is physically out there moving the earth, it is something much darker. He is intimately aware of the friction between the demands of his industry and the fragility of the ecosystem he is actively destroying.
Yeah, and Sergei recounts this one specific Tuesday when the heavy steel blade of his bulldozer struck something highly unusual in the mud.
What did it feel like?
Well, he says the resistance wasn't the hard, sharp shock of striking a subterranean rock. And it wasn't the dense, grinding drag of hitting solid ice either.
So what was it?
It was soft, fibrous, and giving. He actually stopped the machine and climbed down into the freezing mud to check. And tangled within this dense network of ancient, pale willow roots was the dark, perfectly preserved, leathery skin of a massive creature that had been buried in the permafrost for millennia.
Wow.
It was a perfectly intact biological relic, just sitting there in the mud.
And Sergei immediately reported the discovery to his site manager.
He did. And the response he received perfectly encapsulates the entire conflict of the region. The managers demanded he get back in the cab and keep pushing.
Just ignore it and drive home.
Exactly. The extraction quotas were rigid, and the financial penalties for delaying the pipeline construction were severe. The industrial machine is entirely indifferent to paleontology, conservation, or the potential biological hazards locked in the flesh of that creature.
He just doesn't care.
And so, as Sergei engaged the gears and the heavy steel treads of his bulldozer literally churned the ancient carcass and the thawing permafrost into a black, oily soup, he recalled these hushed rumors of zombie viruses spreading among the workers from the research camps situated further downriver.
Just churning it all up into the air.
Yeah, and that realization struck Sergei with a profound, paralyzing dread. He recognized the stark, terrifying irony of his own labor.
Because he's the one digging for the fuel.
He is actively, manually digging for the exact fossil fuels that, when burned in power plants thousands of miles away, will further warm the global atmosphere and inevitably melt the very freezer, keeping the ancient world's biological nightmares at bay. Sitting alone in the vibrating cab of his machine, looking down at his heavy boots caked in a dark mud that felt unnervingly alive with ancient biology, he was silenced by the heavy weight of his own complicity in this planetary unraveling. He is a direct participant in dismantling the Earth's most critical defense mechanism.
But Sir Guy's bulldozer churning up a single mammoth carcass is just the micro-level view of the destruction. To understand the full scope of the industrial collision, you have to broaden the lens to look at the macroeconomic collapse of entire cities.
Entire cities are literally sinking.
Right. Historically, permafrost was viewed by engineers, architects, and urban planners as the perfect, eternally stable foundation. In its deeply frozen state, permafrost is physically harder than reinforced concrete.
It's like bedrock.
It's exactly like bedrock. You can drill deep pilings into it, and the friction of the frozen earth holds massive structures perfectly in place. Entire modern civilizations of infrastructure, from power plants to high-rise apartments, were built entirely upon the assumption that the ground would remain frozen forever.
Which was a massive miscalculation.
A huge one. And the mechanics of infrastructure failure in a thawing permafrost landscape are driven entirely by the basic, unyielding physics of water.
Because water behaves really weirdly when it freezes.
It does. When water freezes underground, its molecular structure reorganizes into a crystalline lattice, expanding in volume by approximately 9%.
9% is a huge expansion when you're talking about millions of tons of soil.
This hydraulic pressure causes the ground to swell and heave upward with incredible force. Conversely, when that subterranean ice thaws, the volume decreases rapidly and the ground contracts, subsides, and physically collapses into the resulting voids.
It just drops out from underneath you?
Right. As the permafrost is forced through unnatural, rapidly accelerated freeze-thaw cycles driven by climate change, the mechanical stress exerted on anything built upon it is immense. The infrastructure isn't just settling, it is being violently torn apart.
I mean, you literally see thick, reinforced asphalt roads buckling, sending massive cracks spiderwebbing across highways. It shears thick steel pipelines designed to transport volatile fuels, just twisting the metal until it ruptures.
And the buildings.
It physically collapses the deep foundations of multi-story apartment buildings. The structures start to lean precariously before eventually caving in on themselves. The friction that once held the structural pilings tight simply vanishes, and the buildings essentially begin to float on a deep reservoir of unstable mud.
Float on mud, fine. And the concrete data quantifying this destruction is staggering. In the Russian Arctic, structural engineers estimate that over half of all buildings in certain major industrial cities are currently structurally damaged, requiring constant, expensive retrofitting just to remain safely habitable.
Overhyped.
Yes. In Alaska, the estimated financial cost to simply repair critical public infrastructure, the vital roads, isolated airports, and train lines damaged by thawing permafrost, is projected to reach $5.5 billion by the end of the century.
$5.5 billion just to maintain what's already there.
Right. And in the Canadian Arctic, the widespread infrastructure damage has destroyed so many residential homes that it has caused severe localized housing shortages. This scarcity has driven rent prices in remote, freezing outposts skyrocketing to levels that rival some of the world's most expensive metropolitan centers.
Paying Manhattan rent to live in a freezing, sinking outpost.
Exactly. And this massive structural failure brings us to a critical, potentially catastrophic intersection. When you combine collapsing concrete infrastructure with aggressive heavy industry, you create a sprawling, ticking time bomb of legacy contamination.
Right, because it's not just empty roads cracking.
Exactly. It is one thing if an empty, remote stretch of highway cracks and subsides into the tundra. It is an entirely different magnitude of environmental disaster when a massive chemical processing plant or a multi-million-gallon fuel depot suddenly sinks into a newly formed swamp, rupturing its storage tanks.
And the scale of this specific threat is massive and, honestly, largely undocumented by the general public. People just don't know about it.
So what are we looking at in terms of scale?
Well, extensive environmental analysis indicates that the Arctic permafrost regions currently contain roughly 4,500 major industrial sites.
4,500.
Yeah. And these sites are actively holding hazardous, highly toxic substances. Associated intimately with these large industrial hubs are an estimated 13,000 to 20,000 contaminated microdumps scattered across the landscape.
Wait, up to 20,000 microdumping.
It is the direct intended result of the historical mindset prevalent during the Cold War and the periods of rapid, unchecked industrial expansion that immediately followed.
Explain that mindset to us.
During that era, the permafrost was viewed as a convenient, permanent vault. Because they truly believed the permafrost was an eternal, impenetrable natural barrier, they treated it as the ultimate waste disposal site.
Right.
Toxic industrial sludge, highly acidic mining debris, heavy metals, and even concentrated radioactive waste from military testing were simply dumped directly onto the ground or into shallow pits and just left on site.
They didn't even try to secure it.
The prevailing engineering assumption was that the extreme freezing temperatures would permanently encapsulate and immobilize the toxicity, preventing it from ever leaching into the groundwater.
Which, obviously, that core assumption has violently failed.
And we have already witnessed the grim preview of what happens when these industrial vaults crack open. In May 2020, the Norilsk diesel spill provided a terrifying, undeniable case study.
Walk us through what happened in Norilsk.
So there was this massive aging fuel storage tank built on permafrost pilings that engineers assumed would remain structurally sound indefinitely. It suddenly destabilized. As the permafrost directly beneath the tank thawed and gave way, the foundation sheared.
Just snapped.
The catastrophic collapse released 17,000 metric tons of raw diesel fuel directly into the surrounding environment.
17,000 tons.
Yeah. The massive toxic plume devastated the surrounding river systems, poisoned pristine lakes, and fundamentally altered the fragile, slow-growing tundra ecosystem for generations to come.
And refined diesel fuel is highly destructive, but the legacy contamination goes much deeper into the periodic table than that. Beyond the biological pathogens waiting to wake up, and beyond the millions of gallons of industrial fuels, there's an estimated 15 million gallons of natural mercury locked organically within the permafrost soils.
15 million gallons.
That staggering figure is nearly twice the amount of mercury currently found in the world's oceans, the global atmosphere, and all other non-permafrost soils on Earth combined.
It is just sitting there.
As the permafrost thaws and the ground erodes, this highly potent neurotoxin is primed for massive release directly into the Arctic waterways. Once in the water, it will rapidly bioaccumulate up the aquatic food chain, contaminating fish and marine mammals.
Which is devastating because eventually that reaches the human populations that rely on those waters for survival.
Exactly. The ripple effects of this profound geological transformation extend far beyond the immediate industrial spills and the waking biological hazards. The thawing of the permafrost is actively creating severe societal upheaval and driving the forced displacement of entire communities.
Yeah, you really have to consider the aggressive mechanics of coastal erosion currently reshaping the Arctic map.
The map is literally shrinking.
In many regions, the coastline is vanishing at an astonishing rate of nearly half a meter per year.
Half a meter a year?
Yeah, and this violent erosion is driven by two deeply connected environmental factors. First, the structural integrity of the permafrost cliffs along the coast is failing. The soil is softening as it thaws, turning from a hard protective barrier into easily washed away mud. Second, and equally important, is the dramatic reduction of Arctic sea ice. Historically, thick, multi-year sea ice acted as a physical shock absorber. It suppressed the ocean's kinetic energy and prevented massive waves from forming during winter storms.
Buffered the land.
Right. But with the sea ice retreating, massive storm systems can now build up unhindered over vast stretches of open ocean. These storms generate massive, powerful waves that batter the softened, thawed coastlines with unprecedented, devastating force.
And you observe the deeply personal human cost of this erosion in places like Tuktoyaktuk in the Canadian North and in numerous remote Alaskan coastal villages. In these locations, entire communities have ancestral homes that are literally teetering on the crumbling edge of the collapsing continent.
It is heartbreaking. The daily lived reality for the residents of these towns is physically exhausting and psychologically draining.
Families are being forced to deploy massive hydraulic jacks to physically prop up and elevate their houses off their shifting foundations up to 5 times a single year.
5 times a year just to keep your house level.
Right. They are locked in an endless, desperate mechanical battle just to prevent their living rooms from sinking into the rapidly degrading ground or falling into the encroaching sea.
And this environmental collapse is not just destroying buildings, it is actively erasing traditional ways of life for indigenous populations that have thrived in harmony with these extreme regions for millennia. Well, for thousands of years, these communities have utilized ice cellars, which are these deep, intricately carved pits dug directly into the permafrost, as highly effective natural freezers to safely store their hunted food year-round. It is a system of sustenance that predates modern refrigeration.
But now the ground is warming.
Exactly. Now, as the ambient ground temperature rises, those ancient ice cellars are melting and flooding with groundwater, causing vital, hard-won food stocks to rot entirely. It's triggering acute, immediate food insecurity across the region.
Because their entire food storage system is failing.
Right. Furthermore, traditional winter travel routes that relied entirely on solidly frozen rivers and lakes are no longer freezing thoroughly. Ice that was once strong enough to support heavy transport vehicles is now dangerously thin.
So they can't even move around safely.
This completely cuts off remote, isolated communities from critical supply lines, medical evacuations, and vital social connections during the long winter months.
It's just a total systemic collapse of their environment. And faced with this, humans are attempting to engineer highly complex adaptations. The engineering responses currently being proposed and tested are born of absolute desperation.
They are highly innovative, incredibly expensive, and deeply localized mechanical interventions designed to essentially hold back the physics of a melting planet.
Tell us about some of these projects, because some of them sound like science fiction.
For example, to combat the catastrophic erosion and the rapid loss of glacial mass, international engineering consortiums have drawn up detailed proposals to build a massive 100-meter-long underwater dam directly in front of the Jakobshavn Glacier in Greenland.
An underwater dam in front of a glacier.
Yeah. The architectural goal is to physically contain the warm ocean currents, prevent them from undercutting the ice, and structurally stabilize the rapidly deteriorating face of the glacier.
The scale of that is just surreal. And there are architectural concepts actively being funded that aim to literally rebuild the ice itself.
Right. One major project involves creating vast fleets of artificial hexagonal icebergs.
Hexagonal icebergs? How do you even build an iceberg?
So massive solar-powered desalination plants would draw up ocean water, remove the salt to lower its freezing point, and pump it into giant floating geometric molds. Once refrozen into massive hexagonal blocks, these artificial icebergs would be linked together like a floating puzzle to build vast, protective frozen masses along vulnerable coastlines.
Basically, artificially replacing the lost sea ice barrier.
Exactly.
And we are also seeing ambitious mechanical interventions designed for large-scale deployment across the tundra itself. Teams of engineers are designing automated pump systems powered entirely by high-altitude wind turbines.
Right, the pump systems.
These systems are designed to extract extremely cold water from deep beneath the glaciers and continuously spray it over the upper ice caps during the darkest months of the winter.
Using the freezing ambient air to rapidly refreeze the water, artificially thickening the ice sheet layer by layer. It's brilliant, but it's desperate.
And on a more localized community defense level, immediate efforts include unrolling and burying thick industrial layers of highly reflective styrofoam insulation and durable geotextiles along the coastlines and over critical permafrost zones.
To physically shield the underlying permafrost from the rapidly rising surface air temperatures and reflect the thermal energy of the sun back into the atmosphere.
But wait, I have to push back here. When you look at the sheer scale of the global carbon emissions warming the atmosphere, you have to ask, are these mechanical solutions just an incredibly expensive Band-Aid applied to a gaping planetary wound? I mean, can humanity truly expect to refreeze the entire Earth using wind-powered water pumps and giant buried sheets of reflective styrofoam while the broader atmosphere continues to aggressively heat up?
That skepticism is entirely warranted. And understanding the limitation of these projects is a crucial distinction. These massive engineering feats are purely localized, adaptive survival strategies.
They aren't going to save the whole planet.
No. They are meticulously designed to buy a few more decades of time for specific, highly vulnerable communities and to protect specific, critical glacial phases. They do not and cannot alter the fundamental physical reality of the broader global climate system.
The physics won't allow it.
Right. The hard, uncompromising data of atmospheric physics dictates that without a 45% global reduction in total carbon dioxide emissions over the next decade, the systemic, worldwide degradation of the permafrost simply cannot be halted by any engineering marvel. The thermal momentum is simply too great.
However, recognizing that these are local adaptations does not diminish the absolute necessity of ambition in reducing global emissions. The mathematical difference between limiting the permafrost thaw to 25% of the Earth's surface permafrost versus a slightly less ambitious emissions scenario that results in a catastrophic 75% total loss is profound.
It's the literal difference between a highly difficult, expensive global adaptation and an irreversible planetary-scale catastrophe that destabilizes the foundation of global civilization.
When you synthesize all of these deeply interconnected threats, the biology, the chemistry, and the infrastructure, the true, terrifying scale of the permafrost crisis really comes into sharp focus. We are looking at microscopic viruses that have lain utterly dormant for 50,000 years, waking up in an environment completely devoid of natural immunity.
We are looking at the physical collapse of modern industrial infrastructure poised to release hundreds of thousands of tons of toxic legacy waste and heavy metals into pristine waterways.
Then driving it all, we are looking at the massive, uncontrolled atmospheric release of billions of tons of ancient carbon and highly potent methane that will exponentially accelerate the warming of the entire globe.
Creating a feedback loop that simply cannot be shut off.
It represents a profound, irreversible shift in the planet's fundamental mechanics. The northernmost reaches of the Earth have been defined for thousands of human generations by their frozen permanence. They've acted as a vital, silent shield, safely absorbing and securely trapping the world's carbon and its ancient, deadly biological history deep underground.
But now, through the aggressive mechanics of the thaw, that shield is actively transforming into an aggressive engine of change.
The permafrost is no longer just a passive, empty landscape to be studied by scientists, or a hard, durable floor to be drilled into by industry. It has become an active, dynamic, and highly volatile participant in violently reshaping the biological, industrial, and atmospheric composition of the entire globe. The door that was meant to stay locked forever is wide open.